Okay. Okay, so I think we're gonna talk about Lee Vygotsky's theory on cognitivism, right? And how social interaction is central to learning. The reason why I kind of wanted to do this one is, well, twofold. Like, and I think you guys will give a better perspective because you've seen a school year without COVID and a year with, and then like, so I had obviously really weird social dynamics as a staff member, but with COVID, were you guys all in person the whole year, or because we did all in person except for the month of November, we did remote learning. What was your guys' situations?
I was in person the entire year, but we did have a few teachers quarantine or students like quarantining. So it was kind of like students were going back and forth if they had to quarantine.
We were actually remote for the entire year, pretty much, with the exception of the last month. It wasn't until April that we had actually done full in person, and even then, it wasn't full in person. So,
right. Because you guys alternated days or something, right? Okay. Yeah, so that's why I kind of want to do it, because I felt like that was a good perspective in having us see the differences with whether they were in person and everything. But one of the things I really liked about it was the whole ZPD, the zone of, I just wrote it, zone of proximal development. I just liked, that circle diagram and seeing like where people were, because I feel like when I was teaching, I was really trying to cater to where they were at to get them beyond that. And I feel like in other teachers, they were just teaching what they were teaching without regard to where that student was. So did you guys notice, like, I mean, I guess it's kind of good we have kind of a blend of whether or not we were in person or not. Because I know when we were remote, it didn't affect my students so much, but other students, you could see like the social interaction, or when they were masked, really hindered their interaction, even with me, or willing to say anything or answer anything. And so I just felt like I never knew if they were learning and understanding or developing any sort of cognitive recognition of anything. And then when the mask came off the last couple months, it was like, oh, you guys have a voice and you can talk willingly, and you understand, or you're willing to ask questions, which was the big thing that I noticed was so different, is that they were willing to like just interact.
Yeah, I definitely noticed a big difference in the way students interacted last year to this year. So like, obviously last year they were not required to stay away from each other or wear their masks or anything. And this year we were in person all year, but we had plastic dividers in between everyone's desks, and they wore their masks all the time, and were 6 feet apart when outside of the classroom when we could be 6 feet apart. And so, yeah, the ability to hear a student sitting in the back corner was really hard. And so I had to be really careful with who I sat there and like who I could trust to pay attention and still try to participate. And also we tried to do everything on the computer, even though we were in person. That way people who were at home and quarantining could still have access. And so it was just like a weird interaction. Like they wanted so bad to be in person and interacting with each other, but we had to like put limits on it. And I think it really affected the way they learned and how much they
learned. I'm gonna be honest. I'm a little bit jealous of you guys, because the remote environment was it was a not pretty landscape. I struggled a lot last year. I mean, there were many times that I just kind of threw my hands up in the air, and I was like, I honestly don't know what to do. I'm trying all of the best practices right now as a teacher, doing everything that, is recommended in the teacher handbook, making sure that I'm not just lecturing to my students, like giving them opportunities to interact with their peers. Part of the problem was that from a very early time period, I think I had mentioned this last time during our discussion, but students were not required to have their cameras on. So that they couldn't even physically see their peers. Just because if one person doesn't turn their camera on, then people will feel this social pressure to start turning cameras off. And I get that. I understand where students are coming from in that regard, but not even being able to see each other's faces, I, as a teacher, can't really verify whether someone is there behind the screen unless I'm calling on each person for every single thing that I'm saying and doing these constant checkups to make sure that they're present behind the screen. The other problem was that for many different activities to break things up, the monotony of, class, we would have discussion groups in which students would go into a breakout room. And, I would have them do games and fun activities, things that they enjoyed doing the prior year that I had been teaching. And they just wouldn't, again, if there was one person in that group that wasn't participating, all of a sudden it was a social pressure for nobody to participate in that group. And so I constantly had to go into all of these breakout groups to see, okay, are people participating? And what do you know? The majority of the groups that I'm going into, nobody's saying anything. And it's hey guys, what's going on? You want to talk? Hello? Anybody there? And it just, that's when I was what am I supposed to do? Do you want me to just lecture for 90 minutes? That's not how you learn. And I feel for students, they do need that constant social element with their peers. And I could tell that many students were mentally checked out a few months into the school year. And even by the time that we had returned to full in person and students were actually able to see their peers, there just was not enough time for them to socially get back to the place where they should have been or where they would have been in a typical year. So may that never happen again for anybody.
It's funny because for me, I didn't know any of the students when I went in, so they're all masked. And so, the thing about the behaviorism or the cognitivism is that the whole scaffolding to support the learner. And I'm half the time I was I don't know who you are. And I don't know much about you, so that was I'm pretty good in general when I would teach at a college at getting to know the students. But with this, I felt just trying to figure out where they were at initially was so hard because I'm they don't really open up about anything. There's, people were just afraid to really do stuff. And I'm sure that probably wasn't how it was before. And one of the things that was really interesting about this theory is how it lends, I want to make sure I say it correctly. The community is central to making meaning for how social learning proceeds development. And one of the biggest issues that we had was initially the county didn't have a mask mandate, right? And then they had one, but no one adhered to it. You weren't forced to do it. And then the school had it. So the students were really struggling with the fact that, hey, they could go out and hang out with their friends and not have to wear a mask. And then they come to school and suddenly it's their mask is below their nose, which I didn't care. I'm anti-mask. But it was a real distinction between hey, I'm going to get in trouble at school. But then we're teaching them the lesson that when they go out, so I think it's almost kind of strange with this theory is that we're trying to progress them to develop these cognition skills, but we're also saying at the same time, hey, you have to wear this here, but you don't have to wear it elsewhere. In the mixed message was just I guess, backwards from what we were trying to do, so it was a real storm, let's just put it that way, of confusion and disagreement. And I felt like if I had to battle like doing it all remotely, I'd have just been like, nope, this isn't even worth it. I'm not really teaching you anything. And I had even said before school had started, I was like, why don't we just do like one subject a day, right? Like, so like on Monday you do your first period. Like we were flex mod, so our schedule was all over the place. But so Monday could have been Latin all day long. So that way, like, you could have done all kinds of different things and forced them to do different things. And then, it would have been weird, but at least if they'd come in, they were all around those same students all day long. And I think that you would have at least probably developed more of that social relationship, I think, than being online, for sure.
I know, like, comparing last year to this year in the social interaction, one of the things that my school spent several days last year, our like professional development days on, was collaborative or cooperative learning in Kagan. Like we were trained in all of these ways to get our students interacting and get our students like discussing and up and moving in our classrooms. And then the next year we couldn't do that. We couldn't have them up and moving, and like they could talk, but they couldn't hear each other unless they were yelling, and which just created chaos. And so like it was weird as a teacher knowing that what is best practice was not possible at the time. And like, how was I going to create that interaction, that student to student learning, which is imperative, but I couldn't do, so that's what I struggled with all year of.
I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, like, so obviously we could see like there was like minimal collaboration between students. And I know that this theory is really more about like how to teach it with the students, but how did the 2 years that you had for collaboration between staff members, like was there a big shift in that too? Because I feel like for now, obviously, like I mentioned before, we had a new administration in the COVID, but I felt like the collaboration was just like non-existent. And I felt like that really affected the teachers, which obviously had the trickle down effect affecting the students. But like the new school I'm going to go to, they sent me this thing today on like some sort of training on collaboration and stuff that I have to go to in Wichita. And I was like, oh, you mean like we're actually going to do some like active strategy planning and how we're supposed to interact, like something that we probably especially should have done last year because it was just like a free-for-all. It's like, hey, here you go, just do your best. And I'm like, how about we have some sort of plan for how we're going to make sure that students are like even mentally and healthily, I'm not saying it correctly, like psychologically okay, right? Because I feel like with them not saying anything to their peers, even like we're being shut down, I feel like there was just a lot of like not neglect and abuse, but just absenteeism. Like when you said, Chris, like not being able to have their camera on, who knows, they could have been playing their phone the whole time that you're doing class and you'd have no idea, So I'm just curious how your staff collaboration may have influenced between those 2 years, even to how you like taught and everything.
In my case, the first year that I had taught, we had constant staff meetings. I mean, every Thursday we had this thing called PLC, which is Professional Learning Communities. And this was just a time at the beginning of the day where our entire department would meet and we would talk about what's going on. I mean, sometimes it was like a vent session for like, guys, I have a problem where, I have this one student who's not receiving input the way that they should. And then we would just discuss various things. Or, it was like, I'm trying to work on a quiz and I'm not sure what the quiz should look like. And we would all help and collaborate in that regard. So there was a lot of collaboration. The other thing is that our staff would meet every single lunch. Like we would always have lunch together. And lunch, again, was a time in which, like, sure, there was venting that would go on. But it was a time for us to discuss strategies for, like, best practices, what we plan to do moving forward. And then with COVID this year, none of that basically happen. We did not have a single staff lunch together in person for the entire year. We only ever met online over the camera. We would like eat, and in the same setting that we're meeting currently to discuss. That was what we did for staff lunches. We didn't have any PLCs all year. It was not designed within the schedule, so none of the departments collaborated unless they took time out of the day to do that, which, spoiler alert, teachers had enough to deal with as it was. Nobody, even though we all wanted to collaborate, we really needed that time built within the schedule. On a personal note, for the staff lunches, I love my department. We're all good friends. We have a group chat where we talk, but I actually checked out of the staff lunches. I just stopped going to the staff lunches. I would eat lunch by myself, and I just existed within a bubble. And yes, maybe socially that wasn't the best decision, but I was just so tired of looking at a screen. I was so tired of, hybrid in which I was talking to a screen and to students at the same time. And I didn't want anything to do with that. Also bear in mind that we had 25-minute lunches. So there's just really no time to socialize. Students complained that it was just too rigid all around. There's a word to describe this. I'm just going to say very bad landscape. That is what this year was for everybody involved. And it really affected everybody mentally, teachers and students alike. So
it's interesting because I'm working on the homework for my other class 806, and I don't remember what it's called, but we have to teach 2 strategies on vocabulary, and this one movie or video was showing that how if a teacher uses 20 or 30 or 60 complex vocabulary words, they basically can advance a student's reading and comprehension and everything by a year. And it makes me wonder, because we had so little talking and so little interaction with the social aspect of development. I'm so did we set them back 2 years then? What was the setback? I mean, my son, luckily, he kind of did okay, I think, but I have to wonder, especially high school kids, because a lot of them, they'll either talk or they won't. But I have to wonder, what's the setback that we really implemented by either being remote or wearing masks and everything? I mean, I feel because that last month and a half or so, we didn't have masks, and it took a week or two, I think, before people felt like it was normal again, just not wearing a mask. You'd always be oh, I forgot my mask. Oh, I forgot my mask. And I just have to wonder, obviously there's going to be a group of people that were really negatively affected, but I have to wonder, what did we really do to these students from the cognition standpoint of muting them for 8 months or however long it was,
Mm-hmm. I think collaboration wise, sorry, kind of going back a little bit, I'm in a unique position, as in my school is really small, K through 8. And so we have 1 class per grade. And so I am the only math teacher in the building. And so collaboration is really difficult. Our middle school team collaborates. So we have 1 science teacher, 1 social studies teacher, 1 math teacher, the English teacher, and the religion teacher, because I'm at a Catholic school. And so we all collaborate, but it can't be I don't know how to teach this math concept, because none of them are math teachers. And so we also had PLC time last year built into our schedule. All of our kids were taking judo, which was interesting, but they were all taking judo, and so they were all being supervised. So we had an hour of PLC time built into our schedule once a week. And this year coming back, that was the thing we all sang praises about. We loved being able to meet and discuss struggling with students, or there were 3 new teachers in the middle school last year. And so there was a lot of what does Catholic Schools Week look like? Or, you know, I don't know how I'm supposed to plan this field trip. So that was really good collaboration. This year, none of that. We had it after school for 15 minutes once a week. And it was us all standing somewhat 6 feet apart, chatting for 5 minutes about how our week went, and then leaving. And yeah, so I think collaboration went way, way, way downhill. And that was the thing at the end of the year. All of our staff, our principal was like, give me some feedback. And we were like, PLC time needs to be built into our schedules. So hopefully.
You just because you're at a Catholic school, like, because I know with one of the things with Vygotsky's, I don't know how to say his name, is that, you know, the emphasis is on culture. And so, like, from like a religious standpoint, how did that social interaction, did that change maybe student dynamics with the religious aspect? I mean, I assume there's obviously a religious aspect at your school, but I'm just curious, like, how that part of that culture maybe changed, even, because that would be kind of an interesting to think, like, did people become more devoted, or were they, you know, more questioning? You know, I'm curious how, if that changed at all.
So obviously churches shut down for a long time, or had virtual mass or service, and a lot of our students were not attending at all, or watching. And so when they came back to school, we had in-person church twice a week. And so I noticed right away that our middle schoolers had, if you ever been to Catholic Mass, there's a lot of like memorization. And so like, I just know the responses from what Father says. And so a lot of our middle schoolers were not participating in Mass. And so we had to like strictly like teach them again, remember, when Father says this, like, your response is thanks be to God, or whatever it is. And so so we had to go back and explicitly teach that. Our school also this year really struggled with mental health. We had several suicide ideation students, and I mean like 7, which is a lot for a middle school of 60. And so just like, I think they were struggling religiously and mentally and all of that. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, because obviously that component's probably pretty predominant, I would imagine, in the school, and, you know, with churches being shut down, and then obviously kind of making that up in school. I feel like here, I mean, I'm not really religious per se. I know a lot of people are here, and it kind of influenced some people here. So I was just curious, since you were in a different type of culture, or in the school in general.
Yeah.
I imagine. Did you, Chris, like, I mean, we had one kid, I think, at the grade school, who like swallowed a lot of sleeping pills, but I don't know of anyone specifically in our high school that was like necessarily suicidal. I'm sure that there were, but did you, with being remote, did you have like maybe a significant portion of that? I would imagine being remote, it just makes it so easy to blend away, you know, from the class and everything.
Yeah, I mean, when we returned in person, so because I teach Latin, like numbers are always an issue with me, and making sure that like I have the largest amount of students taking Latin as possible. So at the beginning of the year, I was kind of given a choice, although it wasn't so much a choice. It was like a catch-22. I could either keep everybody in my program, or I would lose a third of my program, but when we returned in person, I would only have in-person students. Nobody would be online. Because at the beginning of the year, parents were able to make a choice for their students and decide whether or not they felt comfortable having their student go in person. But you had to declare this before the semester started. And this remained for the entirety of the semester. Under no circumstance could you change your decision after the district had changed its educational plan. And I think in many cases, at the beginning of the year, my feeling was that students that chose to remain online were making the right choice. And the reason that I thought that was because it was a mature decision. I know many of the students that were online. I know the kind of students that they are, and they are exceptional workers. I've never had a disciplinary issue with any of these students before. And when we had first returned to in-person, so we returned in person at several different times, because unfortunately, when we returned in person, the number of cases skyrocketed. We had days in which there were 15 teacher positions that were unfilled. And so we had, as it was deemed, free range classrooms in which there were classrooms of literally unattended children, because we didn't have enough substitutes to cover them. And the teachers were like, please shut it all down. We can't do this anymore. And eventually the district's like, hey, it looks like we need substitute teachers to fill these positions. So I could understand and sympathize with the students that are making this decision that, maybe I don't want to be in that environment where I put myself or my family at risk. However, as the year went on, their participation just plummeted. And again, these are some of my top students. I've never had an issue with these students before, no disciplinary issues. What had died, I suppose, in them was just their motivation to learn. And I get that. I would be personally exhausted myself if I had to attend online classes 8 hours a day as a teenager, flipping between all these classes, and then after it, you have to look at the computer even more to do your assignments. It was no surprise that the students that had the hardest time turning things in were those that were online. Those that were in person, totally fine. Because there are just so many issues at play. There's the issue of students being able to interact with peers. Having the sort of collaboration and learning from peers was really important and helpful for students in completing assignments. Just establishing a routine for themselves was more difficult in the remote setting. But I think, Vygotsky mentions that you need a more knowledgeable other in order to learn. And that the more knowledgeable other helps you with the zone of proximal development. And then you sort of gain this language or whatever it is, the skills that you need in order to master whatever it is that you're tackling, thereby growing educationally. In the remote setting, that is just not possible. The only more knowledgeable other is me. Or I suppose if you're participating with your peers, then great. There are some other more knowledgeable others that might be able to explain if they are explaining, if they're participating. But again, in the in-person class, you can assure that. You can see all these students that are interacting, you know who the more knowledgeable other is in each group, they're explaining, all of the students' zone of proximal development is going up as a result. And so at the end of the year, those that had actually been in person learned the most, had the least disciplinary issues, were able to turn in their assignments the best out of their peers. And that's not to, rag on the poor students that were online. It's just the result was that they were by themselves. They had to fend by themselves. And it just was not natural. And it became even more unnatural as the year went on. So.
It's funny because I feel like when we were doing hybrid, we were remote, for a month, and then there was kind of this hybrid when we came back because there was at any, quarantine. Who knows? Like the basketball team was quarantined, right? And it's like, so you have 40% of your class present and the rest are just MIA. And, that whole having someone who's more knowledgeable, like for sure, like in my chemistry class, for instance, in person, you could see the kids that were doing algebra 2 could get by and could help the others, and the kids that were doing geometry, piddling along. But when we were remote, zero comprehension, zero cognitive development, because there's nobody around to kind of like just give them that little extra, like, hey, this is what else we're doing. So, I know that they'll change that requirement because they didn't make it a requirement. I was like, man, you guys should really make algebra 2 be a prereq for chemistry. But you could really see the difference in person. So I'm like, man, when we were remote, did you guys have any idea what we were doing? You're already struggling now. So I think for sure that hybrid was my least favorite, because I felt like I couldn't really pay attention to the kids in class, and I couldn't really help the kids that were on the computer. So I was like, I would rather do one or the other. That whole in between, I was just like, ooh.
I know for us, we always had one computer in the front of the class that was different than like the teacher computer, that had all of the kids who were in quarantine on it. And so whenever I walked into that classroom for math class, I found my other most knowledgeable other in my classroom, and I said, you're going to hold this computer, and if they have any questions, ask me. or you can try to explain it in the chat, because I was doing my best, but I needed someone else in the classroom. And so finding that one student in the classroom I could trust to like try to answer questions correctly, other than myself, so I could get everyone in person started on something and then focus on the people on the computer. But that was definitely hard to balance.
I think that that's maybe where the difference really is, right? Like, because you have the difference of students that can do stuff without guidance and the ones that can. And when they were remote, they all needed guidance. There was no like, oh yeah, like you've got this, because there was just nothing. And so I think that really stood out more with, being remote, was that it was like, you're teaching to all of them, but they're all still at a totally different level. And so it's like, well, who do you pinpoint to at that point? So I felt way lost doing remote and, trying to do science problems and drawings and all these things. I was like, oh my God, I can't. So when we were hybrid, I was like, I got to do it in such a way that you can see it, but you guys can see. I was like, oh, kill me.
Virtual whiteboards were my best friend.
As a language teacher, one of the interesting things, and this kind of goes contrary to what traditionally, if you've taken a language class, like one of the big things in a language class is speaking and being able to speak in the class. But there's actually studies that show that speaking is actually contrary to learning in a language class, because it enhances someone's stress and the feeling of lack of comprehension that they feel. I mean, stop me if this is not you, but like I've been in several language classes where I've just stressed about what I was going to say, that I didn't say anything, and I tuned out everything else that was being said to me because I was so hyper focused on one particular thing. And so going through Vygotsky's theory here of social development, it actually, all of these things ring true in my class, where there's this theory in language just called comprehensible input. And the idea is you literally give simple messages to students, things that can be easily understood by gesturing, such that a student does not need to reproduce what they're hearing, but rather they just need to understand what they're hearing. And that over time, their zone of proximal development in the language goes up, that the more that they understand, eventually words become acquired, boom, they're learning and they're acquiring the language. In the remote setting, when you can't see anybody's faces, you literally cannot know whether students are comprehending the messages. like in an in-person class, we're all teachers because like we can see when a student is confused. So you're explaining something to a student and you see like an eyebrow raise. It's like, oh, okay, maybe I should address that particular student. And Lily, you had said in the remote setting, everybody needs help. That's true. Like literally everybody needs help simultaneously and you have no idea what they need help on. So how exactly can you be the more knowledgeable other when you have all of these people that have different issues and they may or may not address the issues that they have because it's such an unnatural setting? It's just hard to do.
It's funny because, one of the things in the theory is like it talks about how the dialogue with members of society is what kind of helps them. And when you mention the language, once we were in person, I had a student who they were going for Spanish class. They were going to do a Spanish luncheon at a Mexican restaurant and they had to order in Spanish. And one girl, she wasn't in the class, but she was doing it online. The teacher was helping her and they were supposed to order in Spanish. And the girl just like panicked and had a full-blown anxiety attack, went into the bathroom because she didn't want to have to order in Spanish. And then the teacher was like, well, you're not actually in my class, so you don't have to do it. But, just like you said, like she spent so much time focusing on what she was going to say that her social interaction was just completely like non-existent, to the point where, she spent like 10 minutes in the bathroom crying. And I was just like, I don't remember thinking it was this stressful when I took a language, but you could just watch this unfold. And it was like, man, if it's this stressful, then we're really negating any sort of progress in what we're trying to do. So it's interesting you mentioned that, because I watched that unfold with her and I was like, she was like paralyzed with the thought of, speaking up. And I'm like, is this a result of having been masked for the last, 6 or 7 months? How did that play a role in really stuffing down the ability for students to feel at liberty just to say what they were so used to saying? I mean, it just was so abnormal to show up and not have your oxygen levels be normal from the beginning. So that's just really an interesting point. But that's pretty much all I got. But if you have something, sorry.
Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry. No, after you.
Okay. I was just going to say, I always stress to my students communication, because I can't answer a question that I haven't heard, or I can't answer a question that's bouncing around in your head. And so I would tell them, if you don't want to raise your hand, then make a comment on a Google Classroom document. I get the email to my phone, then I can come find you. Like, I can't answer a question that I don't know. And so you have to kind of give your students have to allow you to be the more knowledgeable other. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, in order to answer their questions and give them the guiding questions so they can grow their zone of proximal development, like, they have to ask a question first. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, I gave my students a pep talk at the beginning of the year in the remote setting. I said, okay, guys, each of us, we have a job. My job is to teach. Your job is to be a student. Here's what I do. I teach, okay? I explain things. Your job is to literally tell me when I'm not doing my job. So if there's something that doesn't make sense to you, you need to tell me. In the case of the student that you mentioned, Lily, what we call that is the affective filter that a student has. It's a barrier that keeps you from like processing the language. And that could come for any number of reasons. It could come because the student just didn't feel comfortable with the vocab and reproducing the vocab for a restaurant in like a spoken environment. The student needs something. They're missing something. Generally, the something that they're missing is just more input from the teacher. But if a student gets to the point where their affective filter is that high that like they run away and they can't do it, there's literally nothing that a teacher can do. In theory, as language books would say, just shut it all down at that point and just say, okay, we're done for the day. Because if the teacher speaks anything in Spanish to that student, who cares? That student's not paying attention. They're like, it's gone. And I think, especially in a language class, there needs to be the communication, like you said, Mallory, where it's like, You need to tell me if something doesn't make sense, or say like, hey, Mr. Wilkins, this, grammatical thing, it's puzzling me, I'm stuck. Okay, that's literally my job to explain these things. But students have to help us help them.
Yeah.
We can't be mind readers.
They'll just be swimming in that zone wherever they want without us knowing them. Cool. Well, that was an interesting discussion.
Yeah. I'm gonna stop the recording.